Hey there, class. This week we're revisiting texture and light. However, we're going to talk about it from the perspective of when you render using color and how rendering with color can depict texture and light. So, an artist who is creating a beautiful piece of work will create texture and light in their artwork based upon how they're using color and their different art mediums. So keep in mind that color works with the elements of design. So we've reviewed those from a few different perspectives. And so, more specifically, texture and light can create a certain visual effect. So we're going to look at now how texture and light creates those visual effects when you're rendering your garment pieces in color. So texture. So the color of an object or surface is affected by its texture. So texture can make a surface appear lighter or darker. So a rough surface is going to appear darker in color versus a surface that is more shiny or flat. Those surfaces will appear lighter in color. So when you look at the photograph here from the text, you'll see that you have your pure hue or your base color essentially. You'll have a light surface and then you'll have a dark surface. So when you look at your pure hue of yellow, you just have your basic yellow color or your basic yellow hue. But when you take that and you apply it to, let's say, a shinier surface, that color yellow appears lighter. And then when you compare it to the darker surface, so a surface that might be a little bit more rough in texture, you'll see how that color appears to be a bit darker. So a hue's value and its intensity can imply a rough texture. So that is how a designer can create on paper the illusion of a rougher texture by adjusting the hue's value and its intensity. So now your surface should typically appear the same color in this instance, but the contrast between the values, the greater that contrast is, the rougher the texture will appear to be. So what effects does temperature have on texture? So typically you're going to see cooler colors are going to be used when rendering smooth, shiny surfaces. So you'll see your cooler colors like your greens and your blues and those cooler tones that are rendered for smooth and shiny surfaces. Now, when you have a smooth but not texture, such as like a velvet or like the teddy bear coats, those have a warmer colors when they're rendered, right? So you'll see the differences there between cool colors versus warm colors and how they're used in rendering texture on smooth surfaces that are shiny versus smooth surfaces that have innate texture. So distance should also be considered when you're rendering texture, right? So the greater the distance, texture is not easily observed, right? So the further away something is from you, whether it is the portrait or it is your flat sketch where you are trying to render a fabric, the further away that object is, the it's not as easy for the observer to see texture. So the lesser the distance, though, so the closer it is to you, texture can be more easily observed. So with that, you have to be very detailed in your rendering to be able to get across to the observer what texture it is that you are trying to allude to in your piece. So let's talk about reflective surfaces like metals, for example. So, in order to imply a reflective surface, you have to use a light source, right? So, you want to use a light source to create a highlight. Now, that highlight tends to be a white color or a very pale value of the hue, right? So, when you think about renderings of metal, in magazines or just a picture of something or even a rendering of glass, you normally will see this white highlight that tells you as the observer that the image that the artist is trying to project to you is one of which is metal or glass. So this is basically because the intense light reflection and the color reflection basically provides us, the observer, with a visual cue to let us know what we're seeing is a depiction of, as I mentioned, a metal surface or a glass surface or like a stainless steel surface. So when you look at the image here, you can see all the different metals are listed out here, right? And you also see with each of them that they have a light source that creates a highlight to give the observer the depiction of that metal being gold or that metal being silver. So another important aspect when you are rendering is your light source, or even if you are an individual who enjoys drawing, just anything, right? You want to consider your light source. Your light source is always considered as well in photography, right? So a lot of us are into social media and into taking selfies. And typically, one of the things that we tend to do is consider our light source, right? So where are we getting good lighting from? What angle should we be taking the image from based upon where the light is, right? So the question is, when you are rendering, where do you get the light source from? How do you depict that when you're rendering? So it is depicted through the use of shading, right? So you would select one sole light source when you're rendering, and then obviously you also want to choose the direction of the light source as well. This is important because your light source can alter your perception of the piece that you're observing. So, something else to consider when thinking about our light sources or light in general is that it can steer emotions, right? So, think about walking into a dark space, right? A dark space can give the sense of fear or the feeling of fear, uh, mystery, nighttime, as compared to a space where there is better lighting. So, with this, think about lighting perhaps within your home, right? Maybe you have um, lights that are on dimmer switches, right? So, you can adjust the level of light in the space. So, you can have the lights all the way turned on to the highest setting, right? So, they're the brightest that they can be, or you can start to dim the lights in intervals to create a certain mood or a certain tone. So, logical shading, this occurs when there's no apparent light source. So shading defines forms only with logical shading. Irradiation is the contrast between an object and the ground. And by ground, we can also mean background. Okay, so when we think about the contrast between an object and its background. So, for example, when you have an object that is placed on a dark background, the light areas of the object will advance and the dark areas will recede. So essentially, you're going to see the light areas first before you see the dark areas, right? Your eye is going to be drawn to the light pieces of that work. Versus if you have a light background, then now your dark areas advance, or those are going to be the areas that are captured first by the eye, versus the lighter areas that are going to recede into the background. An artist should also consider the type of lighting that their piece will be viewed in. So what I mean by that is this piece going to be hanging in the interior of a home on a wall where the light source in the home is LED lighting? Or is the piece going to be hanging in the home where the main source of light may be natural lighting, right? Because maybe this home has very large windows where they get a lot of natural light. So those things should be also considered by an artist when they are creating a piece. Because again, the type of lighting or the light source can influence or change the way that colors appear. So there's natural light and then there's artificial light. So natural light is going to be sunlight. Now your natural light is pretty much going to give you a true sense of what color something is. Let's use hair color, for example. Have you ever seen someone dye their hair and you see their hair in natural sunlight versus artificial light, right? Sometimes it looks like two totally different colors. And this is all, again, just based upon the light source, right? So the light source is changing the way that color appears. Another good example of this too is paint, right? Have you ever painted anything, a wall, a sculpture, anything, and you see the item in the sunlight versus indoors under fluorescent lights or LED lights, the color tends to look a bit different.